Hey guys, what's up? It's Tristan. Sorry for the bad lighting. My leg has been really hurting today, and I don't feel like going all the way across the room to turn the light on. So you only really have to hear me. So this is where we are. um, I guess the next subject, I should say, to talk about is school. School has been a nightmare for me ever since the beginning, I guess. Um, really only ever since second grade, though. Um, Kindergarten and first grade went well enough. I had a few friends. In fact, I got along pretty well with the other people that were in my grade. And it just it wasn't until it wasn't until I went into second grade that things became more complicated. Um, and I think that was because as I was getting a little bit older, I was becoming more cognizant of the issues that um, plagued my family. Um, I remember having a lot of issues with trying to make friends and maintain friends. I remember it became a lot easier to lie about my situation. I remember one time in particular where I started crying, and some girls in my class came up to me and they said, "Oh, what's wrong? What's wrong?" And I said, "I'm just really upset. I started thinking about my dad." And they're like, "Oh, what happened to your dad? Where's your dad?" And I told them that I was sad because I remembered that my father had been swallowed by a killer whale when we lived in Alaska, and that he was dead. Um, and that is really what started to happen with my relationship, especially with my father and some of my relationship with my mother. I started to develop this this shell where my relationships were concerned. Um, and I really started not to be able to trust people. And I felt like if I didn't have to trust them, then I was able to lie to them. And I really started to also immerse myself a lot into reading and studying and a lot of other things that took my mind away from where my situation was and definitely put me in a lot of different worlds. Um, One of the things that always really made school complicated for me in being put in special ed in fifth grade was that developmentally I was very far ahead of a lot of kids um, from the second grade onward. Um, by the second grade, I was reading at a fifth grade level. Uh, by the time I was in fifth grade, I was reading at a college level. Some of the first books that I'd read were Anna Karenina, Gone with the Wind. In fact, I remember the issue that I had with Gone with the Wind. I tried to get rented from the Mansfield Public Library, and my grandfather said no, and we got into an argument. And then one of the staff members called Child Protective Services, who showed up at my house, and it was so stupid, so ridiculous. It's just like the time in I believe it was second grade as well. Um, I had developed an affinity for Judy Garland, and I may or may not be foreshadowing, um, but at the time I'd found out how she had died, and that she had died from an overdose of sleeping pills, and this had come to the attention of some of the administrators, and they called child services, and they showed up at my house, and they told my parents, my mother and my grandparents, to hide away all the knives and pills, and it was just a ridiculous thing. It always amazed me how people called attention to the things that really weren't going to hurt me, that were immaterial as far as my world was concerned. I could care less about killing myself. I've never really wanted to kill myself. Um, it's not to say that I hadn't tried, or that the thought hadn't crossed my mind at one point. Um, but they misappropriated the issues, and they kind of cataloged them all for me and put them into a place that dealt with behavioral issues, and eventually it all just kind of turned into my sexuality. And you know, that was probably the most difficult part about going through middle school and especially into high school was my sexuality. It was something that um, I'd not really thought about or come to terms with. And since about first grade, I remember people starting to use the word fag or queer or gay to describe me. And my mother, God love her soul, if she ever would have listened to me and pronounced our last name as Chag instead of Shigay, then it may have saved me some misery in school. Um, but my nickname all through school, from elementary school onward, was Gay J Shigay, or Gay Shigay. And it was just my own personal nightmare in hell. And, you know, it was it was really difficult getting through school, especially through special education, because their idea here was to put you in your own isolated learning environments. And I had interactions with some students with um, English, because I always tested so high in comprehension and creative writing, chorus, gym, and my arts classes. But other than that, it was pretty much just me by myself in a room with different, I don't want to say administrators, but like counselors. We didn't ever really have any teachers that were actually in the classes. They were just dedicated to making sure that we were there. And that was kind of it. In high school, it got worse. Special ed was just a joke. We'd literally go to the room, sit in the room, and they would have all of our assignments written on the board. And you would have your name and all of your assignments, and you'd be given your books, and then you'd be left to your own devices. Um, I'd be there from the time I got there to the time I left. I had chorus out, I had gym out, and I had English classes out. And I could go to the cafeteria for lunch, but that was always a nightmare. People would throw food at the back of my head or walk by and put food down the back of my shirt. One of the worst parts about my high school experience, I remember, was dealing with the head of guidance. When I'd first gotten there, there was a woman that was there who was a real supportive, really incredible woman, and unfortunately, she passed away. She had an aneurysm and she died one afternoon in the cafeteria during lunch, and she was replaced by a woman named Deborah Holgren, who is just an absolute monster. And I remember the first meeting I had with her, myself, and my mother. She looked across the table and she said that based on my history of past behavior and based on my ADHD, um, it would be probably better if I would drop out of school um, when I turned 16, because high school was going to be a waste of time for me and a waste of time for them, because they don't have the time or the resources to devote to making sure that I can stay in line behaviorally as well as academically. And I remember my mother crying. In fact, I remember my mother crying out of almost every single meeting that we had at that school. And it wasn't about what I had done, it was about the things that they would say. And the things that they would say while sitting there and acting as though I wasn't even in the room. Um, so things just kind of escalated, and I would be assaulted and verbally and physically in school, tripped in the hallways, pushed, yelled at, called faggot, sung at, um, and it would just continue and it would escalate through my high school experience. And I would react to the bullies, and I would, tell them to shut up, and I would try to shove them back, and I would be the only one who would ever get in trouble. They never got in trouble, and I remember I had another meeting with Deborah Holgren, and she told me, it's your fault that I made the decision to be gay, and I was going to have to learn to deal with that people were always going to hate me, and that it wasn't their job to police every bully that I came across, and that I had to learn to man up and take care of myself. And that really stuck with me, and that was something that was really damaging. And I think that essentially was the thing that closed me off completely, and from there, high school just became a battle zone. From being crammed in that stupid little room and practically ignored to being harassed in the halls. I remember I had one altercation, and it really sums up the mindset of the people that I dealt with in school. I had some bullies that approached me in the hallway, and they walked up and they called me a faggot. And there was this kid who went to school at E.O. Smith. He was incredible. His name was Matt Guyette. He unfortunately has passed since then. But he turned to these bullies and he said, "Yeah, so what? He's gay. So what?" And they just looked at him and I and they said, "He's not gay. He's just a fucking faggot." And that's what I kind of realized was that this thing that I was being called, the harassment that I was dealing with, the abuse, it was some kind of something that they had created for me. And as far as me dealing with my sexuality and my feelings, it caused even more damage because then it tore me apart. Because on one hand, I had the monster that everybody told me that I was, and the monster that I had experienced when I was younger, which I will get into later. And there was this social construct, the faggot, and I didn't really know how to either put the two together or to keep them separate. And I didn't really know how to look at myself anymore. And mirrors became something that were very, very frightening for me. And eventually, I did start to come to terms with my sexuality, and I came out to my mother. And I thought to myself that it would be easier to move forward if I just came out and said it. Because if everybody kept telling me that I was gay, then I had to be gay. And I started to develop certain feelings, and especially in high school, there was this boy named Daniel that I fell madly in love with, or at least I thought I did, and I scared the crap out of him. I'd write him love letters and all kinds of things. He was bisexual, supposedly, although I never experienced that, and nor had anyone else. It was just very popular when I was in high school to be bisexual. Um, so from there, I just kind of moved on, and the reaction was not a pleasant one um, from my peers and certainly from school. I was essentially completely cut off at that point, with the exception of a few people. My friend Heather and my friend, well, my ex Erica. Um, Other than that, I became even more alone, and I walled myself in even more, and I don't know, everything just kind of became a battle. I became a very angry person, and I left. I left school and I moved to Vermont. And before I had left, I had started to identify as transgendered. And I would wear fashion breasts and wear bras with the condoms filled with water underneath them. And I would wear boys' clothes, not girls' clothes, but I would wear tight shirts and skinny jeans. And sometimes I wore wigs, but I began to think that maybe I was transgendered, and this kind of haunted me a little bit outside of school, and certainly in school, and always kind of worn bell bottoms to kind of test the waters, and also because I thought I looked better in them anyways. Um, but I I wound up moving away. They said I moved up in Vermont, and I lived out there for a short time, and I ended up trying to enroll at Burlington High School, which wound up not working because E.O. Smith at the time was transferring all their records to electronic from paper, and they had lost my records. And so I was basically out on my ass, and I moved around a couple times before finally coming back to Connecticut, and I re-enrolled at E.O. Smith. Um, Before that, I had been moved around. I'd been put into an after-school program at the Natchok Hospital, an outpatient care facility for you know, people here in Mansfield. And I remember the first meeting that we had. I stood up and I said, "Hi, I'm Jay, and I'm nothing like you people." And I did make one friend out of that experience, actually, Tiffany Hinkle. She thought it was hilarious that I had such balls. But one of the experiences I remember having there that scared the crap out of me and really helped to shut me down also was I refused to put some drawings away, and they forcibly picked me up from my chair, put me in a padded room, and a large African American gentleman that worked there sat on my back with my arms held behind my back um, until I stopped struggling. And I was in there like that even after I'd stopped struggling, probably for about an hour. And then he got up and he left me in there for another hour or two. And I was let out to take the bus to go home. Um, I remember going to Manchester Hospital for the second half of my sophomore year and for the first half of my junior year. They had a day school program, and that put me in a place very similar to where I was at Natrog. There was always the threat that if you didn't behave, that you could be brought upstairs and locked up, and some students were. But I was there with students who had tried to kill people, tried to kill themselves, assaulted people, robbed stores, um, just things. I mean, one of the people that was there with was there because he'd woken his mother up with the barrel of a shotgun in her face. I didn't understand why I was with these people. It didn't make any sense. And then it all started to make sense because it was my sexuality. And it was because I was gay that I was being placed in there. They attributed all of my behavioral issues directly with my sexuality, something that up until that point I hadn't even come to terms with. And I remember when I tried to finish my senior year, I was approached by the principal and the vice principal and Deborah Holkman, and they advised against my attending prom. In fact, they told me that I could not go to prom. And when I asked them why, they told me that it was because they felt that if I went, I would either try to dress as a woman or I would bring a boy, which would create a disturbance for the other students. Um, and I found out later that it was at that time that another student at another school had been arrested and removed from his prom because he had brought his boyfriend with him, and they were refused tickets for entry, and they busted their way into the prom anyways. Um, so I wound up rebelling in true me style, and I showed up the next day in a red dress and a black wig, and I went to the blood drive, and they had me escorted off the premises, and I was officially expelled from E.O. Smith. And that was it. That was the end of my high school career. But that's it for today, and thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.